not James Rolfe. I did not grow up with a dragon in my dreams. It was my dreams that were the dragons. Dreams, daydreams, thoughts, musings, ponderings, curiosities of what was, what could have been, and what if. All tying back to a single part of my life, my early childhood years, living in a small town in Massachusetts. Time-wise, those years were rather insignificant, just a couple of years. And yet that small amount of years held such a disproportionate amount of influence over the remainder of my childhood, my adolescence, and beyond. Perhaps it was how young and impressionable I was. These years of my life constitute some of my earliest easily recalled memories as a kid. Perhaps it was that this time in my life was the last time I had what some would call a normal family, with a mother and a father, before we lost my mother to terminal illness when I was very young. Perhaps it was the hard, difficult times after losing her, like getting made fun of for not being local to the neighborhoods when we first came to Connecticut, that led me to be affected by these years in Massachusetts the way that I was. Regardless of the reasons why, these short few years in Massachusetts disproportionately affected the remainder of my childhood and adolescence. It was a part of my life that needed to be left in the past, where it belonged. On September 26, 2016, my dad and I made one last trip to Massachusetts. For him, perhaps it was a trip of curiosity to see what had happened to our old hometown of Warren. For me, it was a trip of closure. Some have said closure was literal, as the beach where I had my earliest memories of going to the beach with Mom and Dad had already closed for the season. Some of the closure was kind of a mix, like my mother's old church. There were no services going on because it wasn't a Sunday, but this was where my earliest memories of going to any church service were. It was also, unfortunately, where I had my experiences of being dragged to church without having a clue what was going on, either in the service or in the Christian faith. I had made my peace with God a long time ago, and with Catholicism as well, but it was great to be back at the actual building where all of this took place, and see that the parish was still functioning. Perhaps if I wanted to be thorough, I could drive out there one Sunday to attend one last Mass at that church as well, now that I actually understand the liturgy. Some of the closure, though, had to be done via brute force, like our conscious decision to not stop at Mom's grave. Some would call this insensitive or disrespectful, but that was a dark time in our lives, decades ago. It was best left decades ago. Plus, we didn't have any money back then, so she didn't even have a headstone, just an in-ground marker, and that was it. The best thing for us to do was to do what we'd been doing all along. Honor her memory, rather than her marker. Unlike the curiosity trips of years gone by, though, I actually got to visit my old school, which was now a municipal building for the town. Think town hall that isn't actually a town hall. It wasn't hard to find an old classroom that still kind of looked like a classroom, even though it was obviously used for meetings and conferences. It was in one of these very rooms on the second floor of this school that I was introduced to computers for the first time on an Apple IIc. Though I wouldn't be interested in working with computers until years later, it all started in a classroom on the second floor, very much like this one. Some of the closure on this trip simply involved me being a grown adult, like settling the score with the Enfield Observation Tower at the Quabbin Reservoir. The steps in this tower seemed endless when I was a fat little 6-year-old running up the stairs on all fours because I was too small to be running up the stairs the normal way. Obviously, the little kid problems had solved themselves, and my biggest challenge was just being a fat guy in his 30s trying to climb up all these stairs. I thought to myself afterwards, though, if I had come here as a junior in high school, I could have easily done laps up and down these stairs all day. So it was a little bit of what if and whatnot, but hey, I got to the top even in the sad shape I'm in right now. So that's another area of the past that can be left in the past. The view from the tower was amazing as always, and unlike those times I'd come here as a little kid, I didn't have to be lifted up to see over the top and see it all. It was fun looking down at birds from above for a change, except for the soaring hawks and eagles way up in the sky, and you can actually see New Hampshire from this tower on a good day. Oddly enough, though, the single most sentimental part of the trip was the visit to the house of my first sitter ever. We were guessing she probably didn't live in this house anymore, and heck, we don't even know if she's even still alive, for crying out loud. But just so much in my life just goes all the way back to this experience I had with my first sitter ever. She was one heck of a stay-at-home mother of 3, and by the time we left Massachusetts, I was best friends with all her kids, and it was rather bittersweet to have to say goodbye. Speaking of which, it's shout-out time. Link, Ned, Amity, wherever you all are, you all rock! Indeed, first sitter ever, best sitter ever. This place was also special to me because it was also where I first was introduced to video games when I was a little kid. Oh yes, the longest-running hobby of my life, it all started here. These folks had an old wood-grained Atari VCS left over from the 70s. I already thought TV was awesome, but being able to control what was on the TV was even more awesome. It wasn't long until I wanted an Atari of my own, and my first console was the ill-fated Atari 7800. But what the heck, it could play 2600 games, that was all that mattered. These folks also introduced me to the Nintendo Entertainment System when it first came out as well. And the rest is history. All of this, by the way, while we were going through the pain and the hurt and the loss of having lost Mom when I was so little. To make a long story short, if my childhood had some kind of MVP award, my first sitter would have gotten it. We even missed the old turn and wound up at the apple orchard where my first school field trip had taken place all those years ago. Funny how things work out. Despite this being quite literally a nostalgia trip at times, though, closure was why I was there. It was the more sobering parts of the trip that reminded us that everything had indeed turned out for the best when we left Massachusetts and came to Connecticut. For example, thanks to my dad splitting bills and my stepmother all those years, I got to grow up in a house instead of this trailer park. Yes, crack all the redneck jokes that you want, but I wasn't even listening to country music at the time. I didn't even know what country music was. I hadn't listened to it before, but yes, there was a time when we were living in a trailer park with a bunch of folks that, well, say what you want, but there were bratty kids that threw my bike into the pond and Dad had to fish it out, and yeah, it was kind of a low point in our lives. There was a time we had no money and he was hungry and eating mayonnaise out of a mayonnaise jar, and we were totally out of food one day, so he took his spinner and his fishing pole and he went and caught brook trout, gutted it, cleaned it, cooked it, and we just ate trout from a nearby river. The ultimate form of closure, and you can't go back on the entire trip, was that our trailer was gone. And according to Google Earth, it had been gone for years, actually, since the start of the decade. So there's your you can't go back moment for you. There were other trailers missing too, and all the empty spots had us wondering if this place even had a future in the first place. I certainly wondered if I would have had one myself if I had stayed there. There was not a doubt in my mind that, had we stayed in that trailer park, things would have been much different, and probably not for the better. A visit to downtown Warren only confirmed our suspicions. I was cracking jokes that because it had been just under 30 years that it was kind of a Back to the Future thing. I should have kept my mouth shut. Think 1980s Hill Valley, but in the 2010s instead. It was like they had never recovered from the recession. The infamous never-ending summer Massachusetts roadwork made the roads and sidewalks look amazing, but all the buildings around the roads and sidewalks looked blatantly like they had seen better days. Even the laundromat in town, which is still the way it was back when we lived there, looked like it had been run into the ground for the last 30 years. And I thought the hick town I grew up in had nothing going on. All that was left in what was essentially a decimated downtown, so to speak, was liquor stores. That's it. That's all that was left. Nice sidewalks, nice roads, but the buildings had seen better days. Even the pizza places were gone. But if you wanted to get drunk, you had options. Both of us also realized while driving to and from this town that things were further out in the woods here than they were where I grew up. I thought where I grew up was a hick town. This part of Massachusetts would have been worse. Much worse. Just the mileage that we were piling on going from point A to point B absolutely dumbfounded us. If there was anything that could get us to appreciate what we'd been through since we left this area and came to Connecticut. It was going back to this area for this one last trip. Many years earlier, my dad gave me a newspaper article from this area about angsty teenagers hollering at all the trains going by on the train tracks, "Kill us!" because there was nothing to do. I see what that was all about. Eventually, our sobering nostalgia trip led us out of those woods and towards the Sturbridge area, where I had lots of other childhood memories and saw a lot of familiar sights, like old mills and stores and shopping plazas that are still around all these decades later, many of which I recognized immediately on sight. We could have gone to Old Sturbridge Village like in years gone by, but I decided to let that part of my childhood remain in childhood. And instead, we went to the plaza where my dad used to work decades earlier to see what was left. What we found there surprised us. The supermarket where he was a meat cutter all those decades ago was still there, renovated of course. The Rite Aid, where we had picked up Mom's prescriptions sadly in the last years of her life, was still there. But most surprising, the J.C. Penney that she used to shop at was still there. With all the turmoil that J.C. Penney has been through in the last few years, as well as specialty retail in general, it was very surprising to see that this was still here, and it was still a store. It wasn't a catalog pickup or something else. It was still here, still functioning. It was kind of like Kohl's, or should I say Kohl's is like a ripoff of J.C. Penney, but the store that I referred to as Penny's growing up was still there. Unfortunately, even this part of the trip had its sobering moments as well, as there were numerous signs that this plaza was not doing well relative to newer shopping centers in the area. Unfortunately, whether we like it or not, time marches on, and retail, in this case, was no exception. During this part of the trip, we also had a late lunch at the Kahula restaurant, which is a Chinese and Polynesian restaurant that was very much unchanged since we had lived there back in the 80s. Heck, Dad and Mom had even gone to that place before. My earliest memories of a Chinese restaurant, or even a restaurant with fountains at all, or something, was at the Kahula. The running joke was, at least the food's not from the 80s. The food was great. It was everything else that was dated. Ultimately, to not hit the evening rush hour of all those folks coming home from the jobs in the greater Boston area, we decided to head back to Connecticut and just parse everything that we had been through. I, for one, said that this trip was about closure. I don't know if Dad was the same way. However, after seeing what happened to our old hometown, both of us were glad that we had gotten out of there and that I had grown up in Connecticut instead of Massachusetts. I went on this trip looking for closure, and I found it in heaping generous amounts. There was not a doubt in my mind when I got home that evening that I was most certainly a Connecticut guy now, as if I hadn't already been enough of one for all the years that I've spent in this crazy state. My romanticizing of the Massachusetts era was dead and buried. I didn't have a dragon in my dreams. It was my dreams that were the dragons. My dreams and fantasies and daydreams and questions of what if, what might have been, and what was, and whether or not it would have been better to stay there. I had my answer. I like the way Rocky Balboa put it in the final Rocky movie. Nothing really hits as hard as life, but it's not about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. I was hit hard when I was a little kid, but somehow I kept moving forward. Same with Dad, same with anybody. Life is about moving forward no matter what. And on that note, it's time to move forward. This is MultimediaJay signing off. Thanks for watching, and thanks for stopping by.